Hopefully that'll work. Okay, so magic loop. Magic loop is another way to work circular knitting. You can use shorter circular needles. You can use double point needles, which we talked about yesterday, or you can use magic loop. When you're working on a circumference, whatever the finished circumference of your item, it needs to be smaller than the size needle that you have. Otherwise, the stitches won't fit. So that's why a 16-inch circular needle is great for a hat, because most hats are more than 16 inches, but not that much more. So the stitches squish up a little bit and it works well. When you're talking about a mitten or a sock, it's a lot smaller than 16 inches. So in the last few years, I don't know how many, they've come out with these little 9-inch circulars, which you absolutely could do a sock on. Here's the downside to them. The tips are 2 inches long, which if you've got any arthritis, and I do, this can be really, I can do about 10 rounds and then my fingers are done and I got to give it a break. For me, I have found that a 5-inch needle is what fits best in my hand and doesn't cause me aches and pains and things. So that's why I've really just moved to the magic loop method. So magic loop is a way of using a much longer circular needle than you actually need. So this is a 40-inch circular needle. This is a size 0. This is actually what I use for my socks, because you could use a 32-inch needle. You could even probably get away with a 24, but once we get started, I'll show you why a 24 is cutting it a little close. I like a 40 because I feel like I have more options, so I don't have to have more needles, although we all have more needles. I like to do 2 socks at one time, and I can fit 2 socks using magic loop on one 40-inch needle. So that's why I prefer the 40-inch. I'm going to show you a demonstration on a 32-inch. So you just have to have a 16-inch won't work, because when you fold it in half, your loop isn't big enough for your stitches. So I'm going to show you magic loop already in progress, just like I did with the double points. And then I'm going to go back and show you how to cast on for magic loop. For me, once you kind of know what's supposed to happen, I think it's easier then to go back and do the cast on, because it's fiddly and it can twist a fair amount. So I'm going to switch to my camera here, and I'm going to show you magic loop in progress. And feel free to holler out a question anytime, or put anything in the chat, whatever works for you. I've got the chat open so I can see that too. Okay, so here I have, this is a 32-inch needle, and I've got about 40 stitches in DK weight here. I'm working on a size 7 needle. I just wanted you to be able to see it. So, but this could certainly be any weight, any thickness, but a 32 gives you a nice long loop. When you are working magic loop, let me slide it back to the cord so you can see a little better. So I'm working, this could be a sleeve, this could be a sock, it could be a mitten, but I've joined it in the round. I'm going all the way around without using small circular needles or double points. When you're using magic loop, you essentially have some of your stitches and what I am going to call the front needle, which is the needle closest to me. And you have some of the stitches on the back needle, which is further away from me. You might see some videos talk about it being a top needle and a bottom needle. And that's if when you're knitting and you're looking at it this way, you could have a top needle and a bottom needle. But for the video, I find it's easier to talk about a front needle and a back needle. So the front needle, I'm always referring to the needle that is closest to me, or if you're holding your needles closest to you. When you're ready to work magic loop, there is a starting position for magic loop. And here's what it is. We want to have both of our needle tips pointing to the right. We want to have our loop on the left. And again, I'll show you how to get this started next, but this is one already in progress. And we want to have our working yarn attached to the back needle. So starting position is needles pointed to the right, loop to the left, working yarn attached to the back needle. So just like in any knitting, your working yarn is always attached to the last stitch that you worked. And we want to go across and work the next stitch ready to be worked. Okay, now here's how we do it. I am going to take, so the stitches here on my front needle are the stitches that need to be worked because my working yarn has already worked these back stitches. So these are the stitches I want to work. I'm going to push them closer to the edge. And now I need a needle to work them. I'm going to pull the back needle, and all of those stitches that were on the back needle are now just going to hang out on the loop. If I had a shorter cord, let's say a 24, this loop would be much smaller and I might lose the loop. Jack's holding up. Are you doing a 24, Jack? Yeah. He's also using very small yarn. If depending on how many stitches you had, you could get away with a 24. But I always end up having more stitches than that, and it always feels like I'm about to lose my loop. If you lose your loop, it's not the worst thing in the world. You can just divide up the stitches again, and I will show you how to do that. Okay, so to get started, I've pushed the stitches that need to be knit to the tip of the front needle. I've pulled out my back needle. Now my working yarn is what I need to deal with. Since I'm going to be wrapping around from the back in a knit stitch, I want my yarn out of the way. I don't want it to hang here because here's what is a tendency to happen. To start to knit and get this caught up over a cord or a needle. So I like to start with my working yarn hanging to the back, ready for me to use it, not caught up in the cord or the tips. Okay, so I'm going to enter the stitch. I hope that's staying in focus. Not grab my tail, wrap my stitch and pull it through. Now, if you were here for the double point class yesterday, I talked about when you finish that first stitch, you want to bring the last stitch that I knit and this next stitch that was just knit, you want to bring them closer together so you don't get what's called laddering or a gap between the two sides here. If I were to tug this now, what it would do is it would bring it closer, but what it also does is it tightens that stitch that is now no longer on a needle. It is now on a cord, which is much smaller. So now I've reduced the size of that stitch. So instead of tightening it now, I'm going to loosen that back up. So it's a regular size stitch back there. I'm going to go in, getting ready to start my second stitch. And now I'm going to tighten it because the stitch is going to tighten up here on the needle. And it's going to pull that a little bit closer without tightening up the stitch that's on the cord. Does that make sense? You don't want to collapse that stitch so much. And the tendency is to want to pull it tight and close. But if you pull it too tight and too close, because you've got the cord here, if this has been a needle circumference back here, it would be fine. But we don't want to reduce the size of that stitch. Go ahead and knit. And now I'm just going to knit across these stitches. And it's just that second stitch that you want to tug it together. The rest of them you can just knit normally. The reason you get gaps on the sides when you're moving, the analogy we used yesterday was it's like you're transferring on a bus. Each needle is a bus, and to get around you've got to change buses. Is that your tension is different. It changes when you're moving from bus to bus. It often becomes very loose, but you don't want to overcompensate and make it too tight. So now I'm here to the last stitch. I'm going to go ahead and knit it. I can let this needle go. And now what's happened is my loop has worked its way over here. I want to get back to starting position. So I'm going to turn it around. And the needle that is now no longer on here, I'm going to push the needle back in. Many times I have pulled this needle out before, and here's what happens is that you can lose your loop. And I'm going to go ahead and lose it and show you how to fix it, which isn't the end of the world because you can just pull your loop out again, but it's just, it slows down your knitting. All right, so I'm going to get back to starting position. Needles pushed in, pointing to the right, loop, loop on the left, working yarn attached to the back needle. If in the early rows of knitting, and I have done this even on just working a circular, and we get a lot of people who are, particularly who are new knitters, that this flips in and out. If you've ever had this happen, and now it's like, I can't get my yarn working, my working yarn on the back. It's because this is flipped inside out, which if you're knitting ribbing, you can't tell the inside from the outside. It looks the same. When you're knitting stockinette like this, the stitches absolutely look different on the inside and the outside. But in ribbing, it would look the same inside and out. So if you're having a hard time getting your working yarn back on the right, it's probably because this is flipped inside out. And that usually happens in the first maybe 3 or 4 rows where it really easily will flip over the needles. So back to starting position, needles to the right, loop to the left, working yarn at the back. Get that to focus. And then we can pull out the back needle, push these stitches close to the edge. Make my first stitch. Don't tug it there. Go ahead and enter the second stitch so that this pulls here onto the needle and then work across. If you are working in wool, this happens to be an acrylic, but if you're working in wool and you still get a little bit of laddering, as long as it's not hugely loose, when you're blocking, you can distribute that tension, that loose tension across the neighboring stitches and get rid of it. If it's really, really loose, you might be able to still see it. We've got to the end. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to push my front needle back in before I pull my back needle out and get back to starting position. Get the tail out of the way, working yarn to the back, needles pointed to the right, loop to the left. Does anybody have any questions so far? So you can continue round and round like that. So I purposely did a little bit loose here so you can see what laddering looks like. You get this uneven, let me get it to focus a little. You get this uneven tension between the front and the back, or the back and the front needle, which if this was wool, after I had, washed the sock or gotten it really wet, I could probably do a little bit of this. It doesn't work so well in acrylic. It isn't as forgiving, but you can, when it's wet, you can redistribute that loose tension so that it's not so noticeable. But, and for some reason, I always have tighter, and I don't know why, away from my cast on. This was my cast on side. This is not. I have no laddering there. I can't figure out why that is, but it's the way it is. If you're working in the round, you need to know where the beginning of your round is. I always follow my tail. My tail is always, you've got 2 sides now. You have this side and you have this side. If I've worked around and I'm back to starting position and I don't know if I'm at the beginning of my round or halfway at my round, I look for my tail. If it's here, then I know I'm ready to start a new round. If it was on this side, I know I only worked halfway around. Another thing you can do is you can't really add a stitch marker because they just fall off. You can put a stitch marker, sandwich it between the first and the second stitch, on the beginning of your round, or another option is to use a removable one. And once you get a couple rounds done, hang it here so that I know when I see my stitch marker, I know I'm at the beginning of a round. If I had just finished and worked halfway around, if I can't see the stitch marker, I know I've only worked half the round. And that way you make sure you've got even going all the way around. If you ever have to put your magic loop down in the middle of working it, just push it away from the needle tips and you should be fine. You can put rubber stoppers, you can put rubber band around the end so they don't fall off, but they can just hang out here on the cord and they should be just fine. Okay, I'm going to show you how to cast on. I did this one on a little bit bigger. So casting on, you can use any cast on that your pattern calls for. This one I happen to cast on, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, I had 22 stitches. So I just did like a long tail cast on here. All right, now I've got 24 stitches. And now I want to divide it. It doesn't have to be in half. If you know you're going to be doing something like if you're making a hat, and if you're getting to the top of the hat where you're going to have to do some crown decreases, you might want to have the stitches divided evenly. It'll just make it easier to keep track going around, but it's not crucial that they be half and half. So I push it to the cord. I'm going to just pick roughly the halfway mark. I'm going to bend the cord, pull a loop. Now, just like any cast on, it can be fiddly and want to twist when you're joining it in the round. So I've pulled my loop and I want to get to starting position. So I'm going to hold this together because I've got my cast on edge facing. I know it's not twisted at this point. So I need to have, I'm going to push them to the needle tips with my needles pointing to the right, my loop to the left. My working yarn is currently on the front needle. I'm going to turn it over. Now it's on the back needle. And I make sure I'm not twisted. I'm going to do this one in ribbing. All right. So just like if you were knitting on circular needles, make sure your cast on is all facing the same direction there. I'm going to start with a knit one. Pull out my back needle. And I'm going to do, not with the tail, knit one. Here's my second stitch. I'm going to give it a little tug on the second stitch. Roll one. So if you were doing a cuff down sock, this might be how you were starting. It might be knit 2, purl 2, might be knit 1, purl 1. If you were starting a hat from the brim up, you could do that this way. Knit 1, purl 1. Okay, so now I've gotten to the end. I'm going to get back to starting position. I'm going to push this needle back in. And what I want to make sure is my cast on edge is still, I don't want this to get twisted over and get caught up. And I want to make sure I didn't twist it when I was flipping it over, but it's all good. So now I'm ready to work across these stitches. It's been joined in the round. Loop to the left, needles to the right, working yarn is attached to the back. Pull out the back needle. And I finished with a purl one. Start with a, so here I've got my yarn caught up in my loop. I really try to avoid that. It just makes it cumbersome. So bring that needle underneath that working yarn, and then you won't get caught up in it. Now it's right where I need it to be. Knit one, go to purl, tug it up to bring it close on that second stitch, and then knit one, purl one. Now what you're going to find here when we get to the end, this will be the end of the first round. If you were working on, you know, either the small circular needles, the 9-inch for a sock, or if you're working on a hat on a 16-inch needle, after you've joined in the round, after that first round, knit, purl, it always, 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 you have this big gap. And that's totally fine. And it tightens up after the next round. And the reason that you get that is because we still have the tail in play here. We're not far enough away from the tail for its tension to hold. Because if I were to pull the tail, it closes up that gap. So don't worry about it. Usually by the second or third round, you don't have the tension from the tail isn't wreaking havoc with this anymore. So if you want, you can pull the tail now to get it closer to its tension, but don't worry that you've got a little gap here. That's why we leave a tail. And when we go to darn the tail in or weave the tail in, we can use that to bridge this little gap and weave it away and you never see it. Okay, so needles pointed to the right, working yarn to the back, loop to the left, pull out the back needle, and knit across these stitches. Need to come under my working yarn. Knit. Was the cast on clear? Did you have any questions about how to cast on? So when you're working in Magic Loop, you can do any stitch pattern. You can do cables, you can do anything that a pattern does, you can do in Magic Loop. It's just another way of working circular knitting. And it should be just fine. If I were, okay, finish that. If I were to put this down and walk away and I wasn't sure if I had completed a whole round or only gone halfway, I can look for my tail. My tail's down here, so I know I only worked half the round and I'm not finished going all the way around. Pull this out, and that really I'm sorry, keep going underneath there. That really matters when you're doing decreases or you have a stitch pattern. You got to know where you are in the pattern because it's like only working across half of a row. But the starting position for the half round and the full round they look exactly the same. So you got to know where your beginning of round is. So yesterday when I talked about using double points, I talked about, you know, if it's the first time using it, that I really recommend you use wooden double pointed needles because they have a little more drag to them. I don't feel that way with Magic Loop because I don't feel like my stitches are going to fall off each end. And I prefer a metal needle personally. You can absolutely do these on wooden needles. It can be a total preference at that point. So here is an example. Since I did knit one, purl one, the inside looks exactly like the outside. And it's not difficult when it's short like this for it to flip over, particularly if you're using a sock yarn. So if you're trying to get started and you can't figure out why your starting position isn't working, it's probably because it's gotten flipped inside out. And that is a pretty common thing. We have a lot of people who drive up here. I don't know what I've done wrong. And all I have to do is flip it inside out and hand it back to them. So it's really common for that to happen. And then you just keep going until you're done. I have a sock. This is actually Beth's sock going here that she's doing. So this is on size 0 needles. So she's working on her sock here. I know that she is at the beginning of the round because here's her tail. She's ready to start the next round. And she's using, I believe, a 32-inch cord. And it works exactly the same way. She's got no laddering. It's got a little bit of varying tension there, but it's not like big gaping anything. It's almost just like it from being folded. When it comes time to block that, even just opening it up, you can't see anything. So she must have taken my last class. And she's got nothing going on here either. That looks really good. Someone please tell Beth I complimented her knitting. She's not paying attention to me. Pull the back out. Working yarns hanging over the back, not in the way. First stitch, second stitch, pull to bring it closer. And around we go.
Pam,
Yeah.
nothing gets changed or adjusted when you are knitting continental, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Nothing is adjusted when you're knitting continental.
It's really not.
Yeah.
It's just, I could do this continental. I can knit continental pretty well. I cannot purl continental with any varying degree of tension. But no, it works exactly the same way.
Yeah, it looked like it did, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yep, it works exactly the same way.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. So she's got, I think this is the pattern that we're going to be working on. So she's got, I wouldn't recommend stopping your knitting right here, but you could if you needed to, because things happen. Just pull it away from the edge. Maybe put a rubber band or needle stoppers on the end so that nothing is going to fall off the end. And then when you go to pick up your knitting, just remember your working yarn is always attached to the last stitch you worked. And you don't want to go closer to those stitches. You want to go away from that stitch. But she's got, there's a pattern in the sock. So she's got stitch markers that are not on the ends. So they can hang out here to know when she has to change her stitch pattern. So you can still use stitch markers the same way. This could be a cable in here. You can, just like you're doing any sort of knitting. So she could have done it this way. And here, since this is a sock circumference, I'm going to show you how this 9-inch needle could also work. But you can see the difference. Some people have no problem using these little needles to go around. I just find that really hard because I have arthritis through my thumb joints, and I end up holding it so tight or in the wrong place that it just puts too much pressure. But it is absolutely an option, and a lot of people do it. And these go all the way down to size, I think size 1s, maybe 0s. So we've got those if you decide you want to do those. Are there any other questions about Magic Loop?
For the keeping the yarn versus the back to the front, do you have any recommendations for how to manage that first stitch if you're doing something like ribbing where you may be purling the first stitch?
Oh, yeah. So let me go.
I've gotten a lot of like yarn overs and stuff.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. All right, let me come over to this one that's a little bit bigger and easier to see. Okay, starting position. If I were going to be knitting, I would want my working yarn, because it's going to be wrapping around the back needle. You want the yarn at the back, just like if you were knitting back and forth, you want the working yarn where you need it to be. If my first stitch is a purl, having it at the back is going to cause a problem. I want to have it at the front, and I want to make sure that it's not wrapping around the needle or the cord. Okay, so if I'm going to be purling, I want this working yarn at the front. I'm going to pull it across the front so that there's no chance that and I'm also going to make sure I'm not doing, oops, I'm not doing this, because now I've just created a double stitch. So bring it, let it just hang, bring it between those needles to the front so it's ready to be used. So when I go to purl, I'm going to come up underneath the yarn. If I go over the yarn, it's wrapping over the yarn and over the needle and creating an extra yarn over. So come underneath the yarn, wrap it just like you were doing a purl stitch. Same thing, go in to make the second, and oop, I did make a second stitch. Let's try that again. Oop, what am I doing wrong here? Hold on.
I think you want the yarn under the needle, not over it.
I do, thank you. Under the needle, there it goes. So now I just have one stitch. Go in to make the second, snug it up and pull it through. And you can purl your way across. I'm going to do it again on the other end so I can show you again. A little bit easier this time because I finished with the purl as opposed to finishing with the knit. Pull this one out. Oop, that's why I keep going in the wrong way. There we go. And then you can work your way across. That was a good question.
So compared to thinking of front or back as you go from the back needle to the front needle, would it make sense to think of the yarn as on the inside or the outside of the knitting?
Yeah, you could do that for sure. Yeah.
Okay, because I know at first when I started ribbing, it was really confusing. Where I'm like, okay, it's in the back, but it's in the front of the back, and it was all confusing.
Right. Yeah, thinking about where you want it to be for making your stitch. Let's get here to the end again.
And it's really the switching from knitting to purling at that stitch that I had trouble with at first.
Exactly. Exactly. So here is getting ready to knit, or I'm sorry, getting ready to purl. If I come and it's here ready for me to work, after you make that first stitch, make sure you've only got one stitch going on your needle. Let me take it out here. Because if you if you've got more than one stitch on there, let's see if it'll focus. You know you had your yarn in the wrong place. So check after your first one to make sure that you've got the yarn in the right place. That was a very good question, Jack.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I'm wondering if that applies to the double points as well, because I was working on those and had the same problem that he was talking about.
Yes.
And couldn't figure out when you went from a knitting last to starting a new needle, if
Yes.
the first stitch tended to be a purl. Yeah, it was a problem.
You do. You have to, and it's even more complicated because you've got an extra needle kind of hanging out there in the middle to work your yarn around.
Yes.
To get it in the right position. So what I would do.
I was going to say, I'm going to show up for your double pointed class.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you go in to make the stitch, always check first, like, okay, yeah, that looks right. My needle, I've only got the one stitch on there. If I had done it incorrectly, so here I'm already bringing the yarn over the needle, which I know is going to be a problem. So even before I complete the stitch, oh yeah, I've already got a problem. So I'm going to bring it back. It's much easier to fix on that first stitch than if you get all the way across the round and you end up with an extra one. So yeah, come to the, yeah, definitely. And I'll focus on, I'm going to write myself a note to make sure that I show that in the double point class too. And then you'll end up getting a habit of, oh, wait, you know, especially if you're doing something in a pattern, I might use a stitch marker to remind me like, oh, I'm switching on this side. I have to switch to purls. Like my first stitch is a purl stitch. As a reminder, I might put a special stitch marker there as a reminder so that I get my yarn in the right place. And once it's a little further along, if you're following a pattern, it'll show up and then you'll be able to see.
So if you find that doubled stitch on the next row, because I was working
Yeah.
a mosaic sock pattern where you had to
Yes.
slip the yarn in the back versus the front from row to row.
Yeah.
I used the little handy tool to just move the yarn over to the correct side
Yeah.
and just drop it. Is that okay to do typically?
Yep. I'm gonna leave the double. So I've created a double stitch because my yarn was in the wrong place. I'm gonna go ahead and work across like what Jack was saying. I'll show you how to fix that because it can be fixed for sure. Let's get across there. And you're going to notice right away, it's really tight to get it back up onto the needle because it's a nice tight double stitch. Okay. Did I make one on this side too? Oh no, I just split my yarn. There we go. All right, so when we come up to that double stitch, and this could be happening if you were doing ribbing too, where you're going back between knit one, purl one, or if you were doing decreases or where your stitch pattern changes a little. Okay. All right. Now push this back in. It's going to be hard. It's going to catch because that double stitch is a little tight. So here I've got, and you can see, focus. There we go. So I've got 2 stitches here instead of just 1. So what you can do, I'm going to look at it here a little bit. I see that it's gotten pulled over. So what you can do is using, like Jack said, that little handy tool. It's got a little crochet hook on it. Or you could either simply purl these 2 together if you wanted to, or part that is not supposed to be there. You can pull that loop off and get it back in position. What is going to happen though, it's going to leave a little bit of a ladder because we had an extra loop of yarn. So one stitch like that is probably not going to cause you great difficulty. You can work that out. So you could choose to knit those or purl those 2 together to get rid of it, or you could unwrap the loop that had been on there, because really it was just the loop, the drag in between got caught over the needle. You can lift it off. You can see that it's going to be a little loose, so I might give this side a little extra tug. So I'm about to do it again. Without tightening up on the cord, do it on the 2nd stitch. And try to close some of that up. Let's see if that worked. So there's a little bit of a gap there, but I think it'll be okay once I get further away from it. Let's get it onto the cord where it doesn't pull. I think it'll be okay once I get a little further away from it. And like I said, if it's wool, you'll be able to work that ease out and you should be fine. Are there any other questions? All right. Switch here. Perfect. So no other questions? I hope that was helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, those 2 videos that I wrote down in the chat from Very Pink Knits are really good and really clear. So if you're working on a project or you just need a refresher, although I did just record this, so hopefully